Good day, ECO736 students. Welcome to week 6 of Development Economics. This week we will focus on economic growth and reduction in poverty and inequality. Just a reminder, for week 6 you need to submit your weekly reading assignment 5 before our lecture on Thursday. Those who are scheduled to present, you also need to upload your presentation on Canva before our Thursday lecture. You will review these slides and video clips and come prepared to ask and answer questions in our discussion forum on Thursday. After this week, you should be able to critically discuss the relationships between economic growth, income inequality, and poverty. You should also be able to explain the implications of these relationships for the achievement of pro-poor growth. So the focus of this week's lecture will be 3 variables: economic growth, poverty, and inequality, and how these 3 variables relate to each other. But before we dive into that, let's consider our context here in South Africa. We know that South Africa has an unsatisfactory economic growth record. On top of this, it also has a very high level of poverty, especially for an upper middle income country. From our lectures last week, you know that in South Africa we also have extreme levels of income inequality by any standard. In fact, we have one of the highest, the highest Gini coefficient in the world. That is before government intervenes. So of course, given our poor economic growth record, more attention should be given to economic growth. But beyond economic growth, we also need to focus on poverty and income inequality because these matter hugely. There are many moral, political, and economic arguments to be had when we talk about these 3 variables of economic growth, poverty, and income inequality. We need to ask ourselves, what would happen to poverty and income inequality in our country if the economy grew much faster? This takes us to the first part of our lecture, where we look at the relationship between growth and inequality, specifically what the impact of growth is on inequality. Does this curve look familiar to you? It should. This is Kuznets' curve, and you've seen it before in your undergraduate development economics. According to Kuznets' hypothesis, the distribution of income at first worsens and then later improves as per capita income increases. So this is what is referred to as the Kuznets inverted U-curve. If you need to refresh your memory, go back to Todaro and Smith and read up on this. I won't spend too much time focusing on this relationship between growth and inequality from Kuznets' perspective. You can read up on some of the reservations of Kuznets' hypothesis. Even himself, he states his own reservations where he says, "I am acutely conscious of the meagerness of reliable information presented. The paper is perhaps 5% empirical information and 95% speculation, some of it possibly tainted by wishful thinking. What an honest researcher." Many others have tried to test Kuznets' hypothesis using empirical approaches or strategies, and a lot of these studies had major weaknesses embedded in them, which were subsequently interrogated. The first source of weakness or bias was the type of data used, and the second source of weakness was country and regional effects, which the methods that they used could not control for. At a later stage, time series analyses were done, and in these cases, the empirical evidence did not support Kuznets' hypothesis. Fields looked at changes in equality during economic growth spells in 22 different countries. And he found mixed results. He found in 10 countries the Gini coefficient increased with growth. In another 11 it decreased, and one country was unchanged. Bruno, Revillion and Squire found similar findings. So in totality, their papers did not prove or not support Kuznets' hypothesis. So what then does matter for inequality? Okay, so according to Gary Fields, he says what matters for inequality is not the rate of economic growth, but the type of economic growth. So this is where we start to consider all those structural factors within economies which development economists focus on. Some of the determinants of the distributional effects of growth include the initial distribution of physical and human assets. So if to start off with, there is a large skewness in how physical and human assets are distributed in a particular country, then even if that country grows and grows at a rapid economic rate, you will find that inequality will tend to persist or even get worse in a country like that. Societal preferences, normative values about fairness, equity, etc., those also impact on distributional effects of growth. A country's openness to trade, is it closed, is it more open, as well as the effectiveness of redistributive policies, how well those policies are implemented by government. All of these issues or all of these determinants will impact how what the distributional effect will be of any kind of economic growth. Next up, we look at growth and poverty, specifically the impact of growth on poverty. So the views of the impact of growth on poverty has changed over the years. During early post-war periods, the consensus was that economic growth is good for the poor. The trickle-down effect or the big push models were largely supported because of this view. In the 1970s, however, this changed to the view that growth actually makes the poor poorer. And so there were adjustments in poor policies and different experiences. From the 1980s onwards, growth was generally seen as good for the poor. So by the 1980s, we had access to much better data and more sophisticated empirical approaches. And the consensus was that the larger the cake, the larger the slice everyone gets from that cake. However, policy also matters and how policies are implemented, but we will chat more about this later on. So looking at China, one of the largest economies in the world, if we look at one specific measure of poverty, the headcount poverty rates, if you look at it over the last almost 40 years from 1981 to 2008, you can see that irrespective of the poverty line used, $2 per day or $1.25 per day, poverty is the headcount poverty rate has definitely decreased over time. And that has occurred globally as a result. If you look at global poverty, it has decreased over time, even though there will be variation in different countries, but growth, and we know that China, at the same time as these poverty rates are going down, we know what has happened to China's economic growth rate. It went in the opposite direction. So it's very clear that an increase in economic growth has a dampening effect on poverty. This table cited by Easterly clearly shows what happens when the growth trends are differing, whether it's strong or moderate, what the impact is on changes in household incomes and poverty, headcount poverty. So when we have a strong contraction of an economy, you can see how this negatively impacts household incomes and also negatively impacts on headcount poverty, which increases. Likewise, a moderate contraction also has that negative impact, but to a lesser degree. What happens when an economy expands instead? And here we're looking at 154 episodes of economic growth. Okay, so this is quite a long time series. There you find moderate expansion has a positive impact on household income, also a positive impact on headcount poverty, but a strong expansion, the relationship remains positive, but it's even greater. Look at that, 8.2% average annual percentage change in household income and negative 6.1 average annual percentage change decrease, in this case, in headcount poverty. So that relationship between economic growth and poverty is very clear. Next up, we look at inequality and poverty. And here we are going to focus on Fields and his views around inequality and poverty, and their relationship with economic growth. And some of this you will have captured in your answer to your weekly reading assignment.